Hello and welcome to our second video on effective curriculum design in RE. Now, in the first one, we explored the effective principles of curriculum design, and as I mentioned in that, those principles could be applicable to any subject within the curriculum. So although we took RE as an example, you could be doing similar thinking in terms of your English, your maths, your history, your geography curriculum. But this video, we're going to be exploring in more detail RE as a discipline in itself. And there's lots of thinking about this going on at the moment, and that's certainly reflected in the Church of England Statement for Entitlement for Religious Education, as well as Strand 7 of the SIAMS evaluation schedule. So just as we did previously, we're going to take three images in turn here to kind of guide and direct our thinking. So first of all, we've got a magnifying glass. So we're going to be delving into, first of all, history as a subject discipline and using that as a springboard to think carefully and more closely about RE as a subject discipline. And the magnifying glass is also useful when thinking about the kind of questions and the ways of inquiry which each subject tradition embodies. We'll then look in detail about RE, specifically using the idea of the three-legged stool in the balanced RE approach of religious literacy. And then at the end, you see we've got the icon of a book, and there I'll be signposting towards various documents and audit tools, which are really useful in thinking about disciplinary RE. So really key within lots of curriculum discussions in the world of English education at the moment is exploring the three questions of why, what and how within curriculum. And this is being increasingly focused upon those three questions, the what, the why and the how, within each discipline or subject that's on the curriculum. So lots of rich thinking's been going on there. So we can see, to give an example, 5 different curriculum subjects which we teach in our schools: maths, English, history, science and RE. Now, with regards to lots of the thinking that's been going on here, of particular importance is Michael Young and lots of his work here. And what he presents is the idea that within each of these subjects, there is behind it a subject community. And that subject community, quite often professional, so it could be researchers, those working in universities, those working in schools indeed. This subject community determines the knowledge that is deemed relevant and important and appropriate within that subject community. So within history, there will seem to be a, what's agreed as kind of content that's right for history. And within maths, we'll be expecting more work with number and algebra because that's seen as appropriate within the maths curriculum. But it's not only the knowledge that's seemed important within each subject, but it's also that kind of ways and traditions and rules of inquiring into that content. So within English, it might take more of a flavour of textual inquiry, which is seen as a really relevant way of engaging with content and developing skills. It may be that in science, a way of engaging with and learning that content is done more through experimentation, where predictions are made, hypotheses generated, and then there's certain ways of testing. And within those subjects, it's kind of a way of, yes, we're learning particular bodies of knowledge, but it's also how do we approach that? How in history are we to be effective historians? How in science are we to be effective scientists? Within maths, how are we meant to be a mathematician? And it's not only what do we need to know to be a strong mathematician, but also what skills do we need to be a good mathematician and to think mathematically with that. And not only are we thinking within each subject domain about the knowledge and the ways of inquiry, but within those subject communities, there's also an element of how do we progress within that subject discipline. And I think there's 2 really useful aspects to draw on here when thinking about curriculum and knowledge. So first of all is substantive knowledge. So what is the body of knowledge deemed important within that subject? And that also includes concepts. And then disciplinary knowledge. So what does it mean to be a mathematician, a historian, a scientist? What are those rules and the traditions of the inquiry? On the next slide, we'll think about history in more depth, about both substantive knowledge, substantive concepts, and also disciplinary knowledge. What does it mean to be a historian, and how does that frame the way that pupils inquire into that subject? Now, before we look closely at history as a subject within the curriculum in terms of substantive and disciplinary knowledge, it's really important to say at the outset that I don't consider myself in any means an expert in the history curriculum, but this is just the understanding which I've got about these two aspects of knowledge within history from my reading. So I'd be delighted to receive comments actually if I'm wrong in any respect here. But from what I've gathered, we could split history into the following diagram. So the aim of history is to promote historical understanding in pupils. And in order to promote that historical understanding, each unit has an open inquiry question. And they could be, for example, from the Historical Association, Columbus, was he a hero? Or who were the Vikings? And with each of these units, each inquiry should be structured in order for pupils to be able to construct an informed response to that inquiry question. So by the end of the unit, pupils should be able to answer in really good detail, was Columbus a hero or who were the Vikings? Now, in order to allow pupils to arrive at that informed response to the inquiry question, involves engaging with two aspects of knowledge. Now, first of all, substantive knowledge and concepts. So it may be, to take these first four, that it's knowledge such as events, factors, places, or even people. So kind of the core building blocks of knowledge that we feel that pupils need to be able to answer those questions. But within the knowledge and content engaged with, quite often they then form a part of a concept or concepts which may be within that aspect of the history curriculum, but also overlap and dovetail into other units within history as well. So it could be through the concept of kingdom. Perhaps if you're looking at Columbus, what about the kingdom of the Spanish? Perhaps it's about liberty. Perhaps it's society. Perhaps we can see how power is being played and enacted within Christopher Columbus's history and narrative, but also in terms of who were the Vikings. But power will be looked at across perhaps lots of different historical units. But then also within the history curriculum, there are these kind of overarching and macro concepts. And these will underpin and flow throughout pupils' history curriculum, and they'll be able to slot their learning, hopefully, within one, many or all of these at different times, ages and stages. So perhaps that's continuity and change, cause and consequence, similarities and differences within a period or situation, and the significance of events and people. So we can see that pupils in engaging with not only inquiry questions on their own, which are open, but also in the inquiry questions throughout their curriculum experience in history, they'll be able to build their substantive knowledge, but also their knowledge within certain historical concepts, which are seen as apposite from the community of that subject. But we've also got disciplinary knowledge. And within history, these kind of aspects of being and inquiring as a historian include things like using source materials, comparing and analysing sources of evidence, and discerning important aspects and contemplating questions of bias and reliability. So within this disciplinary knowledge, pupils arrived at their informed response through being a historian and employing the relevant skills and methods of inquiry. And I found this quote from Byron here really useful, and you can see where I've got that in the references in the bottom left hand corner. That in their history curriculum, pupils will grow in their understanding of what it means to be a historian, developing their disciplinary understanding of how and why arguments and interpretations of the past have been constructed, and also construct their own. Now we have looked at history as a subject within the curriculum in terms of its substantive and its disciplinary knowledge, we can now start to look in depth at religious education. Now, RE has certainly evolved to be a composite subject. There isn't a, as it were, discipline of religious education per se, but lots of different subjects and areas have dovetailed and intertwined to create RE as we see it today. And this is kind of reflected in other subjects as well, such as science. There's lots of different aspects such as biology, chemistry and physics. In geography, that can be split into physical geography and human geography. And within religious education, although there are lots of discussions about it, it seems to be moving towards this idea of a balanced stool, where you have the three disciplines of theology, philosophy, and the human and social sciences. And this has certainly been reflected in two key documents in Church of England schools. First of all, the Church of England Statement of Entitlement for Religious Education, where we can see this disciplinary aspect through the following quote, that pupils are entitled to a balanced RE curriculum which inquires into religions and worldviews through theology, philosophy, and the human and the social sciences. And in the Science Evaluation Schedule, Strand 7 for Religious Education reads as follows. Curriculum planning for RE is effective, reflecting a good balance between theology, philosophy, and the social and human sciences. And pupils confidently, this is within the excellent aspect, pupils confidently give age-appropriate theological, philosophical and sociologically informed accounts of Christianity and other religious traditions. So let's go a little bit further into thinking about the substantive and the disciplinary knowledge within RE at the present time. So lots of this comes from the religious literacy thinking within a few significant voices in the Church of England. And for those of you familiar with RE and the Statement of Entitlement and the New Science Framework, will recognise this religious literacy definition. So a key aim of religious education is for pupils to become religiously literate and have the ability to hold balanced and well-informed conversations about religion and beliefs. Now, this is unpicked within three different disciplines within religious education as it's come together as a composite subject. So we have theology, we have sociology, and we have philosophy. And if we think about this as a three-legged balanced stool, if we have three of those legs in balance, then we're going to be from a stable position to have those well-informed conversations. But if one of those legs is shorter or longer than another one, then it becomes a little bit rickety and unstable and doesn't provide us with that firm basis. And over the history of religious education in England, if one charts it, we can see how in the primary school over the last 20-30 years, there's been a lot of focus on sociology and what people do to the neglect of the theological aspects of kind of why people do that and how that links to belief. Or within arguably the secondary curriculum over the last 10, 15, 20 years, where it's been more focused on philosophy, one could argue, and focused less on the theological and sociological aspects. So what we'll go through now is some of the key substantive knowledge, which is seen as apposite for each subject area, but also then the kind of questions that could be asked, either acting as a theologian or wearing the hat as a sociologist or inquiring as a philosopher. So with sociology, this would include beliefs about God. What is the nature of God as spoken about within biblical texts, or that Christians or Muslims speak about? How are those belief links? So in Christianity, what link is there from incarnation to salvation? Narratives. So that could be in terms of the meta-narrative or the big story of the Bible from start to finish, from Genesis through to Revelation. But it could also be those smaller, those micro-narratives that punctuate it. It could be Moses and the Exodus crossing the Red Sea into the Promised Land. It could be the ministry and life of Jesus. It could be the events of Holy Week, or perhaps even the parable of the Good Samaritan. And it's also sacred text inquiry. So pupils looking into sacred texts such as the Quran and the Bible, and really looking closely and asking themselves, well, what might religious people get from this? What might be the meanings which they glean from this text? In terms of sociology, well, that's observing how people express their beliefs and values and why that might be. And being able to answer that why question is fundamentally pinned on that rich theological engagement at the top of the balance stool. So it could be to do with places of worship or festivals, or rites of passage such as baptism or initiation into the culture. Perhaps it's clothing or expression and worship more widely. And some people might want to express their religious beliefs through art or architecture, or even their life choices in terms of the jobs which they do in their vocation. Many may like to go through challenging social injustices and being courageous advocates. But as a sociologist, we're not only observing how people are influenced by their religious or non-religious worldviews, but also the diversity that's present. So the diversity, for instance, within Christianity in local, national and global contexts, in a way that's not saying that it's a monolithic religion, that all Christians look like this and do this all at once, because there is that rich internal diversity within religiosity and non-religious worldviews. And then philosophy. So philosophy in Greek literally means lover of wisdom. So some of the substantive knowledge could be looking at different views about what is good and how to live a good life. But then the philosopher would ask, well, how do we know? How do we know that somebody's perception of what is good, what is true, kind of stands the test of reason? And what about differing views there? How do they differ, and why might they differ? And certainly core to philosophy are questions of meaning and purpose and truth. So with hermeneutics, there might be lots of different interpretations of sacred texts or various other things. And why might that be? Why might you or I or other pupils in the class interpret a similar aspect or text differently? Could be questions about ontology, what is reality? And epistemology, how can we construct knowledge? How can we either understand what is true and what is out there, or is that inaccessible, or maybe that doesn't exist and we're all constructing our own worldviews and that's part of what we think life is? And are the answers given by us, by others, reasonable? And also ethics and our own worldviews is a really important aspect of philosophy. So within each of these disciplines we've got substantive knowledge, which is seen to be core to those aspects, but of course there are significant overlap between lots of them. But also thinking about how we inquire into them in terms of those subject disciplines. What does it mean to be a theologian, to be a sociologist, to be a philosopher in the subject of religious education, and looking at these three subject areas? In a similar way that we did with the history curriculum earlier in this presentation, we could take RE and kind of map it out. So whereas the aim of the history curriculum is for pupils to arrive at historical understanding, with RE the aim is for pupils to develop their religious literacy. And pupils are to develop their religious literacy through engaging with open inquiry questions in the form of units throughout the curriculum. One example being in Upper Key Stage 2, creation and science conflicting or complementary, or this one here on Judaism, why is the Torah such a joy for the Jewish community? Now the aim of course is for pupils to arrive and be able to construct an informed answer to those inquiry questions by the end of the unit. And in order to do so, they need to build their substantive knowledge and understanding of concepts, as well as their disciplinary knowledge, their way of inquiring into those concepts. So the substantive knowledge or concepts, depending on the unit, may be around the narratives that are there. Perhaps you'll be looking in the first unit at Genesis 1 within the creation and science one, and then other perspectives about creation within that. Certain beliefs which underpin particular views and standpoints in regards to that question, perhaps about the Torah and how it can be used and what it includes. Different perspectives, different voices there, so maybe you'd expect to hear from different voices within the Jewish community, and ideally ones that differ so people can see that diversity, and also different perspectives and different stances within the creation and science conversation, and then how people are influenced by certain phenomena within religious and non-religious traditions. So that could be the influence of scientific arguments, it could be the influence of the watch argument, it could be the influence of the Torah in the second inquiry noted. And then those substantive pieces of knowledge would fit within the baskets of different concepts. So to give 4 examples, pupils will be able to build on their understanding of the concept of God or covenant or salvation or creation, depending on the relevant unit. And then disciplinary knowledge. So pupils will be inquiring into this content as theologians, as sociologists, as philosophers. Now, it's not to say necessarily that you want to have a balance between all of those 3 areas within each unit, but certainly it'd be great within a whole curriculum map overview if a balance could emerge between those, because it may be that within creation science that has more of a flavour of a theological and philosophical underpinning and less of a sociological, whereas within the Why is the Torah Such a Joy unit, it could be that brings in more sociological and theological aspects and less of the philosophical. But in terms of the disciplinary knowledge, what are the ways of inquiring and being theologians and sociologists and philosophers? It could certainly include aspects of textual analysis and how the questions asked as being a philosopher and as a theologian differ from that of a historian, which we'll look at on the next slide. Inquiring into different perspectives is certainly really important within lots of those strands. Asking questions that theologians might ask, that philosophers might ask, that sociologists might ask, and making connections between what they're inquiring into. Perhaps it's between those beliefs and how they influence different people in different ways. But there's also the aspect of reflexivity. So pupils within religious education and those 3 different disciplines reflecting themselves on what their stance and their worldview and their viewpoint is towards different questions. Perhaps with the first one, creation science, conflicting or complementary, pupils emerge with their own view about creation and science throughout that unit. Now on this slide I've put on 3 different references which will be really useful, and indeed I found lots of these really useful when I was a subject leader in school myself, in thinking about how to get that balanced RE and how to make sure that the RE experience of pupils had that balance between theology, sociology and philosophy. Now it's not to say that every single unit should balance between all 3 aspects of those stools, but we'd like to think that across the curriculum map pupils will have a relative balance between those 3, and it may be that certain aspects such as theology has greater precedence in certain key stages in comparison to others. But certainly these 3 links are really useful ones to go to as a starter for 10. So the top one, Religion and Worldviews in a Broad and Balanced Curriculum, is a practical tool which gives lots of information but then also lots of questions to reflect as a subject leader about our RE curriculum and how it's disciplinary in nature. The Diocese of York link, the second one, not only overviews the really key principles of disciplinary RE, but provides also some really useful audit tools for balanced RE, and I'd say that's probably the most important and useful one to go to in terms of auditing our curriculum maps, and also giving a little bit more concrete examples about those 3 subject disciplines and what that might look like in primary RE and secondary RE. And the Norfolk Agreed Syllabus, I thought it'd be really interesting to signpost you towards, because this is the first agreed syllabus which has embraced this approach to RE kind of in its complete sense, and it's a really innovative approach, and I think it would just be really useful and interesting to have a look at this and see what it looks like when it's incorporated and underpins the entirety of the RE curriculum. So as we now come to land and finish this presentation, a few questions which will be useful to ponder going forward. The first one is, I wonder what extent there is a balance between theology, philosophy and the human and social sciences within our RE curriculum maps. And within the resources that we draw upon, such as our agreed syllabi or the Understanding Christianity resource, what is that balance from those resources like at the moment? Do they provide a balance, or do some provide more of a sociological aspect or more of a theological aspect that we need to be mindful of when looking at that balance across our curriculums? And I wonder what your next steps might be here. Perhaps it might be looking at some of the references on slide 2 and just wanting to explore a little bit further. Perhaps it's looking at some of the audit tools. But I thought I'll just finish by showing these ones, these aspects which we drew upon earlier, from the Statement of Entitlement and the Symes of Strand 7, as these kind of root the context of where we are in religious education. So if pupils are entitled to this balanced RE curriculum, I wonder how best we can support them into their inquiry in becoming religiously literate through being theologians, philosophers, and human and social scientists. As always, if there's any questions that anybody has here, please do get in contact and I'd be delighted to chat with you about it. Thank you very much. Bye.